Fun with History, number 19, with Professor Banks. Off with your head. Ah, La Belle Paris. It is quite fantastic to sit here by the beautiful Eiffel Tower and take in this amazing city. I'm enjoying some fantastic champagne here. It's fantastic. The French people really know how to make their champagne. Wow. I'm enjoying some fantastic champagne, awesome scenery, and some great food here. Nothing like some good old bread from Paris. You're fall in love with Paris. And today, here in France, it is here where we're going to learn about one of the most violent times in France's history, the French Revolution. And today's lesson is called Off with Your Head. Are you interested? Stay tuned as we get the music going to introduce our 19th history lesson this week on the French Revolution. Welcome to Fun with History with Professor Banks. And today, here we are, the 19th lesson of our Fun with History. And it is on the French Revolution, which was inspired by the American Revolution, which we looked at last week. So let me give you a little background of the French Revolution, and I hope it works. I have set up technology. I'm going to try to show you a special video on the French Revolution today. And so stay tuned for that. But the French Revolution happened from the years 1789 to 1799. Okay, so what was behind the French Revolution mostly was the Europeans believed the world was advancing. And they believed that America, as a result of their revolution, was starting to change Europe and the universe. Okay? So, what the French wanted as part of their revolution was they wanted equality, very much like the American Revolution. That was what a lot of the American Revolution was about. The lower class wanted to be treated just like the upper class. So equality was a key factor in this, and they wanted no more monarchy. Kind of like, in a sense, the Americans wanted their independence from the British and didn't want to be controlled by them. And I also want to let you know, before we get into the video in a few minutes, that another thing that was happening was the crops have been ruined by hailstorms. Okay, so that is actually a big part of some of the revolt and some of the anger that was going on in the French Revolution is because the people were hungry. The hailstorms have damaged a lot of crops. So that was what's going on with the French Revolution, okay? But first, I want to do a couple of little small things before we get into this. First and foremost, let's get to our joke of the week, shall we? And how many people here, when I did the joke of the week last week, how many people here liked that joke? Sorry, as I'm trying to get this set up here. All right. Got to get my globe in the picture here. There we go. So, I did some one-liners last week. Anybody like those? One-liners. They're pretty funny. I got more of them for you today because I kind of want to keep this on the short side so we can get to the rest of the stuff. Okay, so I got some more one-liners for you, so I hope you like them, okay? I got, let's see, how many of them do I got? 6 of them, okay? First one. Eagles may soar, but weasels aren't sucked into jet engines. Hope you get that one. This is a good one, this one here. If at first you don't succeed, skydiving is not for you. Obviously, if you don't succeed, you're not going to be able to do anything again. And I skydived actually I skydived about 8 years ago. It was awesome. What an experience that was. I did it up in Grand Bend. But anyway, skydiving. A clear conscience is usually the sign of a bad memory. Plan to be spontaneous tomorrow. Borrow money from pessimists. They don't expect it back. And change is inevitable, except from vending machines. So those are a few little one-liners for you. I hope that you like them. Something funny to get us going here this morning as we get into our history lesson. Before I get into the video on the French Revolution, though, I want to talk to you about a couple other things quickly, because I just want to kind of cover that off so that we have time next week to look at a very exciting time as well that we're going to be looking at next week. But I talked about how America became the United States of America last week, and it was the 4th of July. And ironically, we had our holiday on the first Canada Day. So I just want to share with you a little brief thing about how Canada, Canada, yeah. Hold on here. I got to get my official Canada hat on. There we go. Canada. How we became a nation. Canada. So I'm just going to share with this for you. I'm just going to bring this up for you briefly. Okay. It's off Wikipedia. So, Canada has been inhabited for millennia by various Aboriginal peoples. Beginning in the 15th and 16th centuries, British and French claims were made on the area, with the colony of Canada first being established by the French. And here it is. It ties in beautifully to the French Revolution, doesn't it? We're talking about the French today. So the colony was first established in 1537. As a consequence of various conflicts, the United Kingdom gained and lost territories within British North America until it was left in the 18th century, late 18th century, with what mostly geographically comprises Canada today. And I think, if you remember my lesson last week, after the British lost to the Americans in the American Revolutionary War, I think I told you that British was left with control over Canada, and Spain had control over Florida. I believe I said that. Okay, so pursuant to the British North American Act on July 1st, 1867, July 1st, 1867, the colonies of Canada, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia joined to form the semi-autonomous, federal Dominion of Canada. So this was July 1st, 1867. That's why Canada Day is always on July 1st. That's when it became a federal dominion of Canada. So that was kind of what they actually legally called it. This began an accession of provinces and territories to the mostly self-governing dominion to the present 10 provinces and 3 territories forming modern Canada today. And I hope you know what all those provinces and territories are. Let me see. We got Newfoundland, Labrador, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, British Columbia, Yukon, and the Northwest Territories. Did I cover them all? I think I did. In 1931, Canada achieved near total independence from the United Kingdom with the Statute of Westminster 1931. And finally, even though we celebrated in 1867 the birth of Canada, full sovereignty was attained by Canada when the Canada Act 1982 removed the last remaining ties of legal dependence on the Parliament of the United Kingdom. So, that is a bit on Canada. And I'm proud to be Canadian. It's a great country to live in. We get 4 seasons sometimes. We don't know what we're going to get weather-wise. It can be the summer and it can be 15 degrees out. You never know. But Canada is a great country. So, yay for Canada. Okay, I'm going to go back to being French now, okay, if you don't mind. Bonjour! Hello! I'm French. Okay, so that was the birth of Canada. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope that that's interesting for anybody who's watching. Now, what I also want to talk about briefly today is something that happened, another violent time in American history, a bloody time in American history, and it was called the American Civil War. Okay, so what happened, and this is jumping ahead a bit too. We're still in the 1700s, and these are in the 1800s, these last two things, but I want to mention them right now because they kind of do tie into what we've been talking about. And next week is going to be a great lesson too with some really great stuff in it. So the American Civil War happened from 1861 to 1865. So 4 years. Doesn't seem like a long war, but it was a long war. It was a violent war. It was a very grim war. Lots of people lost their lives, and I'll tell you in a second how many. So what was behind the American Civil War was we had 2 sections of the United States, okay? So we had one section up here, called the Northern States, okay? And then down here, you had the Southern States, okay? And there were 7 states specifically in the South that were really behind this war, okay? So South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Okay, all those states there. They were called the Southern States or the States of Confederacy. That's what they were called. Now, what was the big thing behind this war mostly was slavery. How many people here think slavery is cool? No. Slavery, not cool. Not cool at all. But the northern states, there was a lot of slavery going on at this point in time in America. The northern states wanted slavery banned. But the southern states, they didn't. They thought slavery was cool. They thought slavery was good. They thought slavery was a great thing. So they didn't want it banned. So that was a big spark to set off this war that was going on. Another thing behind it, the southern states really actually wanted to be their own state. They wanted to all join together and say, hey, we are our own state. Kind of like what we've had here in Canada sometimes when Quebec has wanted to be their own kind of separate thing. Same thing. So slavery, number one and foremost, but they also had differences. The North and South also had differences between how they viewed trade, how they viewed tariffs, how they viewed state rights. Okay, so they fought and they fought and they fought. Okay, this is what happened with the Civil War. And at the end of it, after 4 years in 1865, 750,000 Americans had lost their lives. 750,000. That is a lot of life lost over something kind of really kind of stupid, really. So that's what happened. A lot of Americans lost their lives. What happened as a result of this war? The war ended up having a good result. Slavery was abolished, and the Confederacy that the 7 states in the South had collapsed. So they weren't their own separate state. They weren't their own separate country. They are obviously all part of the United States of America now. So that was a good thing about the war, but not very good in terms of the lost life and how violent it was. So that was the American Civil War for you. Okay, how are we doing here? 16 minutes. Good. Okay, so let us get to our video. I hope I can set it up for you. It's the French Revolution in 10 minutes. That's what it's called. And I hope that you like it. I am actually going to show it to you on my TV and put it through my webcam. So I hope that you actually can see it and enjoy it. It's kind of a cartoon movie, so that's kind of cool. But the French Revolution in 10 minutes, okay? So let me just bear with me for a second as I get the audio set up for it, and we'll get going on it, okay? Professor Banks is still here.
The Kingdom of France had been ruled for centuries under a regime of monarchy.
Okay, there we go. Still setting it up. Bear with me.
The Kingdom of France had been ruled for centuries under a regime of monarchy, aristocrats and the church. There was a huge social divide between the wealthy and powerful clergy and nobility and the working people. 18th century Europe was seeing a growth in colonialism, and with many powers trying to come out on top. The French economy had growing pressures and bad harvests and ineffective tax systems which taxed the lower classes heavily but included many tax exemptions for the nobility and clergy. Sounds familiar. Not to mention the many wars, including aiding the American Revolution against the British. These wars gained little for France itself, but required a lot of money to rebuild their forces. By 1787, King Louis XVI called together the upper-class Assembly of Notables to address the growing French financial crisis, but it was ineffective. Louis XVI was a pretty ineffective king, quick to back down from a decision, and out of touch with a lot of France in his palace in Versailles. The Age of Enlightenment had seen much forward thinking in science and philosophy, seeking to question tradition and faith using science, with an importance of freedom of thought and freedom of speech. These thoughts spread throughout the people, questioning the king's right to rule, the Catholic Church's wealth, and its influence within politics and the state of the country. As king, Louis did have supreme power and proposed to tax the nobles, but the Assembly of Notables refused to cooperate. They claimed Louis needed to bring together the Estates General, a general assembly of the three estates of France, the clergy, the notables, and the common people. That next summer in 1789, Louis assembled the Estates General. The clergy and the nobility wanted one vote per estate, giving them a 2-to-1 advantage over the much bigger third estate of the common people. Obviously, the third estate wanted to vote per person, giving them the much bigger number and being much more democratic, but the first two estates couldn't agree to this, so the third estate, which consisted of many well-educated lawyers and businessmen, began meeting independently of the Estates General in what became the National Assembly. The National Assembly was to represent the people, not the estates. Louis didn't like this at all and ordered the Salle des Estats to close, stopping them from meeting. The National Assembly went to a nearby indoor tennis court and swore to not separate until they'd come up with a constitution for France. Members of the first and second estates began to join them. Louis began to pour the military into Paris and Versailles as support for the National Assembly spread. Louis fired his financial advisor Jacques Necker as he'd published dodgy economic figures to the public and manipulated public opinion. All this was seen as a move against what was now the National Constituent Assembly, and the people of Paris began to riot, joined by some sympathetic French guards, leading to the storming of the Bastille, a royal fortress full of weapons and ammunition. The governor of the Bastille ordered a ceasefire, but that didn't stop the mob beating, stabbing and decapitating him, with a saw no less. The city mayor was butchered and the riots continued. Louis backed down, letting Assemblyman the Marquis de Lafayette command law and order. He proposed to adding national French white to the Paris colours of blue and red to create a new cockade for the National Guard, which would go on to become the French tricolour. Law and order fell apart as word of revolution spread throughout France. Many of the nobility fled to neighbouring countries and looked for help. As panic and rumour spread, the commoners of France formed militias and some stormed chateaux of the nobility. Seeing these rural uprisings, the National Assembly abolished feudalism, ending the flow of taxes from the poor to the clergy and the nobility, bringing more freedom and equality to the people. The people still had to pay a release to own the land they lived on, but they refused to pay for long enough that they ultimately got the land for free. The old regime of France had been destroyed and a new order was to take its place. Eventually. The National Assembly published the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, influenced in part by Thomas Jefferson, who'd written the American Declaration of Independence. It was a list of rights and ideals for the Constitution writers to strive for, although it didn't actually apply to women or slaves. By October, crowds of women were gathering in Paris, angered by hard economic conditions and bread shortages. There was growing fear that the aristocrats were hoarding food and starving the poor. They marched on Versailles in protest and on the next day stormed the palace and killed several guards. They demanded that the king move to Paris, which he did, ending his independence. Huge resentment against the Roman Catholic Church led to all its land being confiscated by the government as it took on the Church's responsibilities. The clergy in France became controlled by the French, muscling out the influence from Rome. As 1790 came, the government began to organise itself into various opposing parties, while they worked on the new constitution. Things seemed to be settling down, as the first anniversary of the storming of the Bastille was celebrated in Paris, along with King Louis himself, people swearing fidelity to the nation, the law, and the king. Divisions in class saw the military weaken as upper-class officers left, unable to control their working-class soldiers. Various political clubs began to spring up to debate politics. Most notable was the Jacobin Club. By 1791, the king began to fear for his safety, while his wife urged him to call for foreign reinforcement against the revolution. They decided to flee to the Austrian border, disguised as servants, but were recognised at Varennes and returned to Paris as prisoners. Up until then, people thought the king had supported the revolution. This escape attempt felt like a betrayal, and talks of a republic began to stir. On writing the Constitution, the Assembly were more in favour of a constitutional monarchy, with a king remaining simply as a figurehead rather than a full republic. The people on the streets, however, gathered to sign a petition to depose the king. Lafayette sent the National Guards to control the crowd. Stones were thrown and the guards shot dead between 13 and 50 people, depending on who you ask. The Assembly, once the revolutionary body of France, was now clamping down and killing more radical revolutionaries. Louis's brother-in-law, the Holy Roman Emperor Leopold II, along with the King of Prussia, sought to defend Louis and threatened an invasion if he was threatened further. This really angered the people. The Constitution was completed, the king restored to his place, and the National Assembly was dissolved to allow the new Legislative Assembly to govern as a constitutional monarchy. But it failed miserably and practically fell apart within a year. France had changed so much on the ground amidst the revolution that the government didn't seem to reflect the people. Republican and anti-monarchy ideals threatened to spread throughout Europe, and to strengthen its position, France declared war on Austria weeks after Leopold II died. Prussia came in to help Austria, and France suffered many defeats due to disorganised and deserting armies. In August 1792, Federé soldiers of the Paris government attacked the king's palace, massacred the king's guards, and captured the king. A rump session of the Legislative Assembly was held, consisting mainly of revolutionary Jacobins, to suspend the monarchy. The Paris government was essentially in control now, but Austrian forces were advancing on Paris. Fearing traitors within the prisons, they had many prisoners killed and urged other French cities to follow suit. And they did. But then, of course, these acts were seen as too harsh, and politics rolled up into another mess. It was then voted upon, and the Convention Assembly became the new government, which would write another new constitution. It immediately abolished the monarchy and declared France a republic, a system of government where the leaders are representing the people, usually elected by the people, and thus should reflect the needs and opinions of the people. At least that's how it should work. The 22nd of September 1792 became the dawn of the French Republic, coinciding with a decisive victory at the Battle of Valmy against the Prussian invasion 2 days before. France had proof it could be strong. France continued to win victories in the Rhinelands and Austrian Netherlands, grabbing the attention of Britain and the Dutch Republic. Because he tried to flee the country, Louis XVI was tried by the Convention Assembly and found guilty of high treason by conspiring with the enemies of France, so they executed him in January 1793. This really woke up the rest of the monarchs of Europe, who went to war with France, initially taking back much of what was gained. The war continued to put a strain on food supplies in France, allowing the radical Jacobins to seize power. Led by Maximilien de Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety, they sought to stamp out anti-revolutionaries in France. So they executed thousands of people in what became known as the Reign of Terror. They confiscated grain and food from the countryside to feed the cities and controlled food prices, but this didn't go down too well either. At this time, even suspicion of being against the revolution could have you sent to the guillotine. The government began conscripting people to strengthen the weakened army. During the Reign of Terror, the government became extremely anti-Christian, closing and destroying churches, designing new 10-day calendars to forget when Sunday was, and establishing alternative churches like the Cult of Reason, but was ultimately a step too far as it led to counter-revolutionary movements, including Vendée in West France, which would fight against the revolutionaries until 1796, suffering massive massacres on both sides, again depending on who you ask. People ultimately got sick of the terror, and it was voted to have the Jacobin Club banned and Robespierre himself executed, along with many others, because why not at this stage? The coalition of countries against France were unwise to not take advantage of these internal fights, and by summer 1794, France pushed right back through Austrian Netherlands and even into the Dutch Republic itself, forming a puppet state. Prussia and Spain ultimately made peace with France in 1795, while Austria and Britain and others remained at war with them. The French government had settled on the constitution of the year 3, establishing yet another new regime called the Directory, run by 5 directors, and it wasn't too successful either. France tried to aid Irishman Theobald Wolfetone in a Republican invasion of Ireland against British rule in 1796, but failed to land due to bad weather. France's army continued to win victories in Switzerland and Italy, led by a very successful tactician named Napoleon Bonaparte. Austria sued for peace as he marched on Vienna, ending the War of the First Coalition. A second coalition of monarchies, including Britain, Austria, Russia and others, joined against Republican France in 1798. Napoleon knew France's navy wasn't yet ready to take on the might of the British Navy, so he decided to invade Egypt and disrupt the British trade route to India. British naval commander Lord Nelson came down and destroyed Napoleon's ships, keeping Napoleon's forces stuck in Egypt. In 1799, hearing of defeats in France, Napoleon made his way back to Paris and overthrew the Directory, ultimately with yet another constitution declaring himself the first consul. Though it was still a republic by name, it was very much a military dictatorship, with Napoleon at the head. The revolution had set out to stop one guy controlling everything, and by the end of it, they again had one guy controlling everything. Napoleon pushed against the coalition, leading to victory against the Holy Roman Empire in 1801 and Britain in 1802. They would remain at peace for another 14 months, and then would follow what would become the Napoleonic Wars. But sure, I can tell you about that some other time. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you want to see more videos like this, you can donate on Patreon. And you can also find my Facebook and Twitter pages. It's loads of fun reading all the comments and seeing all the debates, and I'm glad to see that I can get some people talking about history. Thanks, and subscribe.
Okay, this is your history professor back. And I hope that that came over okay. I hope that you could see that and hear that. And I apologize for the inconvenience in the middle of it. Phone rang, and don't people know I'm taping a history lesson here? Come on, don't call me right now. Okay, so that was the French Revolution for you. And I want to just... He talked about the Napoleon Wars, and first and foremost what I want to do briefly before we end here is he talked about the terror, where a lot of people are sent to the guillotine, and that is why I called this lesson Off With Your Head. Okay, so 16,500 people were executed in Paris alone with that, and then 25,000 more across France. A lot of people lost their heads. And some of these people were executed for little reason other than suspicion. Or others had a stake in getting rid of them. Okay, so a lot of lives lost again due to the terror and the guillotine. The Napoleonic Wars, okay, Napoleon Bonaparte kind of saved the Republic, but he became a dictator too, which is what they were trying to get rid of to begin with. They did get rid of Napoleon Bonaparte, okay. He went against Britain, Austria, and Russia, Napoleon Bonaparte. And in 1811, he had control over Europe he had the large span of control over Europe from Spain to the borders of Russia. Not including Britain, though. Not including Britain. Britain wasn't included. And then he wanted more of Russia. And that was his big mistake going into Russia, Napoleon, because as he went into Russia, it took a lot longer than he envisioned. Many people in his army starved to death along the way. And those who didn't starve, because it took so long to get into Russia, it was in the middle of winter. And we all know how cold Russia gets in the winter. So a lot of other people that didn't starve to death froze to death. So that was kind of not a good thing for Napoleon to try to get Russia. As a result, Europe turned on France. Okay, all of Europe got together and turned on them. Napoleon had too small of an army, and he was forced into exile on a place called the island of Albalia in 1814. Napoleon came back from the island a year later, and he tried to give this a second try. He was like, okay, I'm going to try to get control again. Didn't work then either. 1815, there was a battle called the Battle of Waterloo, and probably a lot of you have heard of Waterloo. That was what happened. He tried to get control over again, and Europe joined together to fight him and sent him off again. And so he was sent off to an island again, and that is where he died, actually, on the island. Believe he died from health complications or something like that. So anyway, that is what happened to Napoleon Bonaparte. They eventually did get rid of him, and the French finally did have some peace. So that was our history lesson today. I apologize, we're a little bit long today, longer than usual. But I hope that you enjoyed everything I put into this, and especially the Eiffel Tower at the beginning. That was really, I was right by the Eiffel Tower. What a beautiful place. So anyway, next week we are going to look at the Industrial Revolution, the last revolution we're going to look at. And then we're going to get into some really exciting history after that. Even next week it's going to be exciting. So I'm going to sign off now. This is your professor signing off. And I do hope that you've enjoyed this lesson. And until next week, take care.